without shouting, she simply says, "They took her." There is no immediate crying. There are no questions. Just a direct statement, as if she already knew exactly what had happened. But how? Who exactly did she think had taken Madeleine? What if everything you know about this case is just the tip of the iceberg? A dark secret is about to emerge, and it could turn this story completely upside down. For years, when we hear the name McCann, the first image that comes to mind is that of a family devastated by grief. A missing little girl, a global search, headlines, lit candles, and a desperate plea for justice. They were portrayed as absolute victims. But what if that wasn't all there was to it? What if the story we were told, the one that dominated newspapers, documentaries, debates, was incomplete? What if a fundamental part of that narrative had been carefully concealed from the very beginning? It's as if we were faced with a huge puzzle. Everyone looks at the picture assembled on the table and says, "Here it is, this is the truth." But as time passes, you realize that some pieces have disappeared, and worse, they didn't vanish by accident. Someone deliberately hid them. Do you remember the first time you heard about Madeleine? It was a heart-wrenching story, one of those that stops the world. A child disappearing from a resort in Portugal while her parents were dining with friends just a few meters away. But what if that night hid something much bigger, something so delicate that it could never be spoken aloud? In this video, we're not going to repeat the same versions as always. We're going to look at what was left between the lines, at what was never said directly, and perhaps, in the end, you'll see this story from an angle you never imagined possible. Now think with me, what if the parents, even if they did not commit any direct crime, knew something important that night and chose not to tell? Yes, it sounds absurd at first glance. After all, which father or mother would hide something in the face of their own daughter's disappearance? But when you start looking closely, certain details just don't add up. The heavy suitcase that appeared and then vanished from the records, the cleaning of the apartment before the arrival of the forensic team, and that enigmatic phrase from Kate McCann, spoken at the exact moment she realized her daughter was missing. They took her, but who are they? And why that immediate certainty? There's more. Trained sniffer dogs able to detect the scent of blood in a corpse indicated signs inside the McCann apartment, including in the car they rented days later. And yet all of this was treated as noise, as if it had no value. Why? Why was the official version so fragile in so many points, accepted so quickly by British authorities and the press? Why did the narrative of the McCanns as mere victims gain so much weight, while legitimate questions were ignored, silenced, or treated as conspiracy theories? What if they weren't lying entirely, but they also weren't telling everything? That is the true heart of the mystery, a secret so deep, so delicate, that perhaps even the pain of losing a daughter was not enough to bring it to light, tearing families apart or even facing criminal consequences that could devastate even further. From that point, the question changes. Could it be that the McCanns' greatest fear that night was not just Madeleine's disappearance, but what the full truth might cause if it were to emerge? Over time, the case grew to become something larger than any investigation. It turned into a kind of media showcase. Headlines, interviews, newspaper covers. But behind the camera lens, there were a series of actions that contradicted the public narrative. Reports from Portuguese investigators describe a family more concerned with public image than with the details of the investigation. Refusals to answer basic questions, rehearsed statements, long silences when confronted with inconsistencies. And all of this was compounded by media coverage that shielded the parents from the very beginning. Why was that? Because of legitimate commotion? Due to diplomatic pressure? Or because exposing certain truths simply wasn't an option? In the end, the Madeleine case became more than the search for a child. It turned into a struggle to protect a story that perhaps was never complete. A dark room. Silence. Kate McCann climbs the stairs, her heart racing. The light from the corridor filters through the slightly open door of the children's room. She enters. The crib is empty, the sheet rumpled, the window ajar. She stops for a second, her face frozen, and then, with a tense voice, but without shouting, she simply says, "They took her." There is no immediate crying. There are no questions. Just a direct statement, as if she already knew exactly what had happened. But how? Who exactly did she think had taken Madeleine? In the next few minutes, you will learn about hidden documents, forgotten phrases, hushed reactions, and understand why silence may have been the only possible protection for a secret so dark. Thursday, May 3rd, 2007. Resort Ocean Club, Praia da Luz, Portugal. Kate and Jerry McCann were dining with a group of friends in a restaurant inside the resort. A group of 7 people, later known as the Tapas 7. They agreed that each one, at different times, would go to the rooms to check if the children were safe. It was like an informal rotation of vigilance. According to reports, around 9:05 p.m., Jerry goes to the apartment, checks that everything is fine, and returns to dinner peacefully. Shortly after, around 9:30 p.m., another person from the group goes to check. But this part already starts to get confusing. Some say they saw the door ajar, others say they noticed nothing strange. The times don't add up, and the accounts don't match. Until around 10 p.m., Kate goes upstairs and finds the room empty. And then comes the phrase we mentioned before. She runs downstairs and says in contained panic, "They took her! They took her!" But took whom? Who took her? How did she know that at that moment, without seeing signs of forced entry, without witnesses, without confirmation? The first minutes after the disappearance would be crucial for any investigation. But here, the scene began to fall apart before the police even arrived. People entered the apartment, friends walked through the room, objects were touched. Kate herself called friends in England before officially calling the Portuguese police. It was as if the impulse was not only to ask for help, but to control the narrative from the very beginning. And that's when the first tension emerges. Was the truth of that night already being shaped while there was still a chance to find it? With the arrival of the Portuguese police, the case started to gain contours of an international mystery. But the relationship between local investigators and the McCanns soured quickly. And it wasn't just because of the pressure, it was the attitudes. The Portuguese police expected total cooperation, but they found resistance. Simple questions went unanswered. The couple avoided interviews with investigators, but gave lengthy statements to the British press. They seemed more concerned with how they were being seen than with the actual progress of the investigation. And then, the conflict exploded. The British media began harshly criticizing the Portuguese police. Newspaper after newspaper questioned the competence of the investigators. At the same time, the McCanns were presented as an exemplary couple. Doctors, British, well-dressed, emotionally strong. Their pain became a symbol of global commotion. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, the first serious contradictions began to emerge. The Tapas 7 group started to be heard, and the accounts did not match. These details is either a clue or a trap. In less than 2 months, the police already had clear doubts. How did sniffer dogs indicate traces of blood and the odor of a corpse in the McCann room and in the rented car days later? Why did the family not allow a reconstruction of the night with their friends? Why did Kate refuse to answer 48 formal questions from the Portuguese police? The image of the perfect family was beginning to crumble. It was as if the truth was right there for everyone, but shrouded in a curtain of fog. And every time someone tried to pull that curtain aside, something or someone pushed it back into place. After the spotlight was turned on the McCanns, something curious happened. The more strange clues appeared, the more the narrative of victim parents seemed to solidify in the media. In practice, there was a growing list of disturbing details. The sniffer dogs, for example. 2 dogs, one trained to detect the smell of human blood, another to detect the scent of a corpse, alerted several times inside the McCann apartment, first in the living room, then behind the sofa, and also on Kate's clothes. One of the dogs even indicated the trunk of the rented car days after the disappearance. The forensic report did not nail down a conclusion, but the smell doesn't lie. The emotional reaction of the parents also came under close observation, and what was seen was a series of decisions that at the very least raised doubts. One of the most striking moments occurred during an interview when Jerry was asked what he thought of other lines of investigation, aside from kidnapping. He did not answer immediately. He looked away, took a deep breath, adjusted his shirt and said, "All hypotheses are being considered, except the one that we would have done something." The phrase came out coldly like a shield, but to many it sounded like a slip. This type of reaction can be explained by cognitive dissonance, that mental state in which someone knows there is a painful truth, but cannot or does not want to face it. So the brain reconstructs reality. It creates a new narrative, one in which the blame lies with others, where what happened was not a choice, but a consequence of bad luck. But what if part of that pain was the result of a decision made in seconds and protected ever since? A question began to circulate behind the scenes of the investigation. Why did the British press coverage shield the McCanns so much? The answer might lie in something simpler than it seems. Jerry and Kate were not just ordinary parents, they were doctors, upper middle class, British citizens in a foreign country. From the start, there was a collective emotional reaction of identification and protection. They couldn't be the guilty ones. It was too hard to imagine. But there was more. An internal dossier indicated that the couple had ties with prestigious figures in the United Kingdom. The then Prime Minister voiced his support for the family within the first few weeks. Public resources were released to reinforce searches in another country, something that is rarely seen, even in local disappearances. In that atmosphere of pressure, any clue that deviated from the main narrative was met with suspicion. The media preferred to tell the story of loss and hope, not one of suspicion and collapse. And it is at this point that the secret begins to sustain itself not only through the family's silence, but also through the behavior of institutions. Like a wind that erases footprints in the sand, some information simply disappeared. Kate's personal diary, for example, was cited in Portuguese police documents. In it, there were phrases like, "Today I caught myself wishing I wasn't here. It's unbearable." A legitimate outpouring of grief or a reflection of something deeper. Time passed, and the accounts from the Tapas 7 continued to change. Dates, times, phrases. No one remembered exactly how that night went. A fog was forming, and the more details disappeared, the more silence took shape. By now you begin to realize, perhaps the secret isn't in something that was said, but in everything that was never spoken aloud. After so many questions, disappearing clues, contradictory testimonies, and uncomfortable silences, the line begins to form. It isn't as clear as we would like. It isn't a recorded confession, but it's there, made up of gestures, of reactions, of details that repeat themselves without anyone noticing. The turning point came when Portuguese investigators assembled the last pages of Kate's diary. Among erased phrases and confused notes, one word appeared more than once: guilt. And it wasn't the guilt of others. Witnesses said it appeared on the apartment's balcony days after the disappearance. But then, no one knew where it went. This suitcase was never officially recorded as evidence. Yet photos of the scene before the police arrived showed something similar. Now add to that phrase, "They took her," spoken by Kate with such certainty. Was it just an emotional reaction? Or was it the unconscious way of telling a story without having to say aloud what really happened? What if something happened that night inside the apartment? Not an external kidnapping, but something that got out of control. An accident, a moment that changed everything. And what if, in light of that, the decision made wasn't to tell, but to protect? Protect what remained, the other children, the reputation, the marriage, the structure, their own sanity. That's when everything fell into place. The evasive behavior, the delays in responses, the refusal to cooperate with reconstructions. It wasn't just fear of being accused. It was the fear of facing their own truth, the fear of opening the door to something that could never be undone. Can you imagine what it is to live every day between the pain of loss and the weight of a secret? This is perhaps the most human and darkest part of this story. We are no longer talking about villains or innocents. We're talking about people who, in a single second, saw everything crumble, and who, in trying to contain the shards, created a narrative so strong that not even they could escape it anymore. In the following months, Jerry assumed the role of spokesperson for hope. Kate became the face of longing. But in interviews, there was always an unease behind their eyes. A slow blink, a smile that seemed forced, as if every public sentence was a tightrope walk, as if the truth was there, behind their eyes. And that's when Nietzsche's words come into play. There are no absolute truths. Sometimes what seems like a lie may be a desperate effort to protect something bigger than the truth. Sometimes hiding isn't about deceiving, it's about not collapsing. Does this change everything? It does. Because it shows that perhaps the truth of the Madeleine case is never really about what happened, but about what was not said, about what was protected, about what was lost even before the girl disappeared. The suitcase vanished, the dogs alerted, the testimonies contradicted one another, but the silence that remained intact, like a shield, like a wall. And perhaps that is the McCann family's dark secret. Not a cruel crime, but a choice made in the midst of panic, in a moment of pain. A choice that could never be undone. A choice that, to this day, no one has had the courage to fully confess. But now you have seen the pieces that were hidden. There is something in this case that goes beyond what the headlines showed. It's not just about the disappearance of a child. It's about image, about control, about silence, about how sometimes the fear of losing everything leads us to hide even what is impossible to hide forever. In my opinion, what we saw here was the portrait of deep pain, but also of a choice. And it isn't a simple choice. It's one made in a second, on impulse, and then becomes a prison for life. When everything collapses, the natural reaction may not be to shout the truth. Sometimes it's about constructing a version that seems bearable. That doesn't destroy everything all at once. That's why this case will continue to be remembered, not only for its mystery, but for that invisible layer no one wants to touch. The thin line between despair and cover-up, between the instinct to protect and a truth that never comes back. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about understanding that, yes, sometimes silence speaks louder than 1,000 words. And the hardest part is knowing that perhaps the truth will never be told, neither by them nor by anyone. By the way, if you've come this far with me, comment below, "I am made of questions," just so I know you stayed until the end, thinking along with me. And if you'd like to see what lies behind the scenes of pain, the media, and the truth, subscribe to the channel. We're going to keep digging where almost no one has the courage to go.
They hate you.